The wheat field had been burning for 2 days. Senior Sergeant Alexei Voronov, 26 years old, lay flat against the bottom of a shallow trench outside the village of Mitsensk and listened to something approach from the west that he could not yet see. The sound arrived before the shape did, a mechanical shrieking, like gears being forced through material they were never designed to process, layered beneath a deeper bass vibration that moved through the soil itself and into his chest cavity. Men around him were pressing themselves flatter, as if the earth might accept them if they asked urgently enough. Then the tree line opened up, and what came through it was not what any of them had trained to face. Whatever it was not losing. October 1941. The town of Mitsensk sits roughly 200 miles south of Moscow, on the Zusha River, in the kind of flat Russian landscape that seems designed to make approaching things visible from enormous distances. And yet the German tank crews advancing through that country that autumn were encountering something that their optics, their training, and their accumulated battlefield confidence had not prepared them for. Panzer General Heinz Guderian, perhaps the most instinctively gifted armored commander the Wehrmacht produced, would later write in his memoirs that the fighting near Mitsensk represented the first moment his forces encountered the new Soviet tank in significant numbers, and that the experience demanded immediate and serious attention from German high command. He was not a man who alarmed easily. The fact that he alarmed at all tells you something essential about what his crews were running into. The machine that produced this alarm was the T-34. And the question this documentary intends to answer honestly, not with propaganda and not with reflexive skepticism, is whether the tank's towering historical reputation is proportional to what it actually was, whether the legend matches the machine, and whether the men who lived and died inside it were served by a weapon worthy of their sacrifice. The T-34's reputation in popular military history has achieved a kind of monument status. It appears in virtually every serious account of the Eastern Front as the decisive technological factor. The machine that stopped German momentum, absorbed German steel, and eventually drove the Wehrmacht back to Berlin. Documentaries have called it the war-winning tank. Historians have built entire arguments around its production numbers and sloped armor as the foundational material reasons for Soviet victory. All of that contains truth. None of it is the complete picture. Because the T-34, when it first appeared on the Eastern Front in June 1941, was simultaneously a revolutionary weapon system and a near-catastrophic operational failure. And understanding how both of those things were true at once, how a tank could be technically ahead of its time while being tactically squandered on a massive scale, is the only way to evaluate its legacy honestly. The tank's origins lie in the mid-1930s, in the competitive and often lethal atmosphere of Soviet military-industrial development under Stalin. Mikhail Koshkin was the chief designer at the Kharkov locomotive factory, and the machine he developed, through iterative prototypes designated A-20 and A-32 before the final T-34 configuration, represented a fundamental philosophical break from contemporary tank design doctrine. Koshkin's central insight was the integration of three qualities that most designers of the era treated as mutually exclusive: sloped armor that multiplied effective protection beyond its raw thickness, a diesel power plant that reduced fire risk compared to gasoline engines, and a wide-track suspension derived from the Christie design that provided genuine cross-country capability in the mud and snow of Russian terrain. The 76.2mm gun was capable of defeating any German tank in service in 1941 at combat ranges. The sloped 45mm hull armor resisted penetration from German anti-tank weapons that could defeat much thicker vertical plate. On paper, and in its essential engineering philosophy, the T-34 was genuinely ahead of anything Germany was fielding in 1941. Koshkin's gamble, and it was a gamble, because he pursued the diesel design against significant institutional resistance, paid off in the specifications. What it could not fix was how the tank was used. Here is the number that complicates the monument. In the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Union lost approximately 17,000 tanks. The T-34 was among them in enormous quantities. The Red Army possessed roughly 1,000 T-34s at the start of the German invasion, and the majority were either destroyed in combat, abandoned due to mechanical failure, or lost when their units were encircled and overrun. The reasons for this disaster were multiple and interlocking. Soviet armored doctrine in 1941 had been recently and brutally disrupted. Stalin's purges of the military officer corps in 1937-1938 had decimated the experienced leadership, capable of executing the kind of deep mechanized warfare that theorists like Marshall Tukhachevsky had developed. The men who might have understood how to use massed armor effectively were dead or in labor camps. What replaced them was a command structure paralyzed by fear of making independent decisions, because independent decisions under Stalin could constitute the crime of deviation. When German forces drove deep into Soviet territory in 1941, they captured or threatened the industrial heartland of Western Russia. The response, the evacuation of Soviet industry eastward, beyond the Ural Mountains, was one of the most audacious industrial operations in the history of warfare. The Kharkov locomotive factory, which had built the T-34, was dismantled and shipped east. The Ural tank factory at Nizhny Tagil received the equipment and workforce and began producing T-34s under conditions that strain credibility. Workers operating in partially constructed buildings, in temperatures that froze machinery overnight, on diets that medical science would classify as starvation rations. The Chelyabinsk tractor plant was retooled and expanded into what workers called Tankograd, Tank City. In 1942, Soviet factories produced approximately 12,500 T-34s. In 1943, over 15,000. By 1944, the production figure approached 16,000 in that year alone. Germany never came close to matching these numbers for any comparable vehicle. The Panther, for all its tactical superiority in crew ergonomics and optics, was produced in quantities that Soviet T-34 output swamped by ratios that made individual vehicle quality increasingly irrelevant at the operational level. The workers who achieved these numbers were not soldiers. They were women, teenagers, and men classified as too old or too injured for military service. They worked 12-hour shifts. They slept in factory dormitories when dormitories existed, and in the open when they didn't. They are not in the documentaries. Their names are not in the histories in the way that commanders' names are. But the T-34's war-winning case rests on their backs as much as on any design decision Koshkin made. By the summer of 1943, 2 years of catastrophic learning had produced a Soviet armored force that was fundamentally different from the one that had disintegrated in 1941. Corps and Army-level tank formations had been rebuilt and retrained. Radio equipment had improved significantly, partly through American Lend-Lease deliveries. The officer corps had been replenished with men who had survived long enough to learn from experience. And crucially, Stalin had been persuaded, not easily, not quickly, but eventually, to allow military professionals greater operational latitude. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest armored engagement of the war, demonstrated this transformation. The T-34-76 that fought at Kursk was not a significantly different machine from the one that had been lost in such numbers in 1941. What was different was how it was used. In depth, in coordination with artillery and anti-tank defenses, within a strategic framework designed by Zhukov and Vasilevsky that traded space for German exhaustion before committing armored reserves for counterattack. The T-34-85, introduced in early 1944 with a new 3-man turret and an 85mm gun capable of engaging Tigers and Panthers at reasonable combat ranges, addressed the most serious ergonomic and firepower deficiencies of the earlier model. It was not the best tank of the war on a one-to-one technical comparison. Against a Tiger II or a late-model Panther with an experienced crew, it remained at a disadvantage in a straight engagement. Soviet doctrine, correctly, stopped asking it to win those engagements individually, and instead asked it to win the campaign collectively. So, was the T-34 the tank that won the war, or just hype? The honest answer requires resisting both the monument and the revisionist demolition of it. The T-34 did not win the war because it was the best tank, measured by optics, crew ergonomics, gunnery accuracy, or mechanical reliability. Several German designs exceeded it at various points. What the T-34 contributed, alongside the human cost that accompanied every Soviet military achievement, was a combination of good enough technology and producible at scale design that allowed the industrial output of Tankograd and a dozen other factories to sustain armored formations through losses that would have permanently destroyed any force built around more sophisticated and less reproducible machines. It was a weapon designed, perhaps unconsciously, for the kind of war the Soviet Union was actually going to have to fight. A war of enormous duration, geographic scale, and material consumption, in which resilience mattered more than peak performance. There is a category of historical object that carries more meaning than its specifications justify. Not because it was the finest example of its kind, but because it was present at the moments that mattered, in the quantities that mattered, wielded by people who paid for every lesson in the hardest currency available. The men who died in T-34s in 1941 died partly because of decisions made by a political system that valued obedience over competence and purged the people best equipped to save them. The men who survived in T-34s by 1944 do so because enough people learned enough of the right lessons quickly enough to change how the machine was used. Neither group was served by simple, heroic narrative. Both groups deserve the more honest account. Senior Sergeant Voronov, lying in his trench outside Mtsensk in October 1941, did not know he was present at the beginning of something. He knew only that the burning wheat field smelled of fuel, and that the machine coming through the tree line was not stopping.